want to thank everybody for coming this afternoon. My name is Fred Litwin.
Noted author Fred Litwin. And of course, Fred is also the author of I Was a Teenage JFK Conspiracy Freak, On the Trail of Delusion, and Oliver Stone's Film Flam, The Demagogue of Dealey Plaza.
Fred Litwin is here. He's a longtime author and certainly watcher of politics.
Joining us, Fred Litwin. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much. Welcome to another edition of On the Trail of Delusion, where we try to separate the wheat from the chaff, and we actually try to present serious discussions on the JFK assassination, the kind of material that you just won't see on typical conspiracy YouTube videos. I'm absolutely delighted today to have Alecia along as my guest. Alecia is a professor of history at Louisiana State University at Baton Rouge. Alecia has written 4 books. The latest book that she's written is Cruising for Conspirators, which is all about Jim Garrison's prosecution of Clay Shaw in the 1960s. This is her 4th book, and there's another book coming on the way, which we'll talk about. Alecia has a MA from Ohio University and a PhD from the University of Delaware. And I have to say that your book, Cruising for Conspirators, is not only one of the best books written on this topic, but I know this topic, but in fact, when I read this book, I found it exciting. I found your narrative to be incredibly exciting. Even though I knew it was going to happen, I said, wow, this is so well written and so interesting that this book is going to stand the test of time. I mean, 100 years from now, people will still be referring to this book as one of the classic books on the case. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And my first question is sort of what got you interested in Jim Garrison?
So, my work and training as a historian, my dissertation was focused on the city of New Orleans. And so New Orleans really is kind of like the central location for the stories and histories that I'm interested in as a, research historian. And my first book was about the history of prostitution in New Orleans between the end of the Civil War and 1920 and the Storyville Vice District. And one of the sources that's very rich in New Orleans is court records. And so the first book was really based on a series of court records. And what you see immediately, whether you're looking at New Orleans or Louisiana more broadly, is that there are many miscarriages of justice. And that's true everywhere. But because New Orleans is such a distinctive place and has so many characters, sometimes these stories are just super vivid out of the court records. And I originally set off, I think, to write a book about New Orleans in the 1960s, just to kind of understand that decade in the city's history. But, I came across the Shaw story and the Garrison prosecution, and that seemed like, a glaring example of a miscarriage of justice. And, as you know, the evidentiary record around just the Garrison investigation is huge. And so, that was plenty of material to write a book, and it's plenty of material to write half a dozen, more books in terms of, that particular district attorney's tenure in office. But it was also really, it was a very volatile time in the United States, but it's also a really volatile time of change in New Orleans. And so that's my background as a historian and a research historian is New Orleans, and also the history of sexuality. So the first book is really about, kind of as a feminist take on prostitution. And this book really reflects kind of my sense of, how badly LGBT plus people were treated in fact and in law in the mid 20th century, and how this case not only is an example of that, but it really kind of provides us a window into how that worked, on a kind of mechanical level in law and in culture and society. And so that's where my research comes from, is an interest in New Orleans and the history of sexuality.
It's, New Orleans is a fascinating place. So, you're an historian, and I think you've probably read a lot of conspiracy books on the JFK assassination. But can you talk a bit about your expertise as a historian and what that brings to the table, and how you might, when you read conspiracy books, how are they lacking in what you would call good material for historians?
So, I was thinking about this a lot, and I'm teaching a historiography course for graduate students this semester where we really look at the history of how historians are trained, what they're taught to believe about what they're doing, and how that changes over time. And, in the early 20th century, I think historians were really obsessed with the idea of objectivity. And they felt like they could just be objective enough that they could, rebuild the past in a very reliable way. And that belief in objectivity, I think, has really waned over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st. And I think most people are willing to acknowledge that they have, presumptions about things, that they have sort of, they bring things to the table with them that help shape their work. But having said that, I think the really valuable thing about the way historians are trained in graduate school is that you really are taught to focus on evidence, right? Question formulation is, an act of creativity and imagination and predisposition. What are you interested in? But once you settle on a question, you really are trained to identify as much archival material as you can and try to put that story together in as complete a way as you can, understanding that there are questions you won't be able to answer. Much of the material written about Garrison at the time, and then let's say like in the late 20th century, no one was super polarized. But beyond that, the books that seemed to me the best books were the books that were dealing in evidence, right? Either archival evidence, or they're going out and doing interviews. Like you've done a lot of interviews, right? And you're talking to people, about things they experienced or saw firsthand. And there's this whole class of books related to the Garrison investigation that are so obsessed with defending Jim Garrison and defending his activities, particularly around the Kennedy assassination, but more generally. I think I tried really hard to be fair to Jim Garrison as a historical figure. I don't think he's an admirable person or public official, but I really looked at his record from, the late 40s forward. And a lot of the things that happened, and a lot of the things that happened in the Garrison investigation, there was a pattern that was already set, before he got there that gets replicated in his prosecution of Clay Shaw. And there are numerous examples of that. So, I think looking at that, staying in the evidence is something that I think historians are trained to do. And I teach a course for undergrads called The History of Conspiracy in the United States. And we really look at it from the time of the Declaration of Independence to the 21st century. And, there's a question that I always ask them, when they make assertions about things. And there are, I have numbers of students who are, predisposed to conspiracy thinking. But we always kind of, land on that question about what is the evidence here, right? And, in terms of the Kennedy assassination, the preponderance of the evidence is that Lee Harvey Oswald did it. Are there many, questions about, where he was and what he was doing and what the hell is going on here? And, obviously, but if we're going to stay in the evidence, that's where you land.
Yeah, very true. And I think the same can be said. The evidence against Clay Shaw is pretty weak, if not almost non-existent.
Right. Yeah, it's very shoddy. Mou Chambra, who developed a lot of testimony among witnesses. And the big example, there's the Clinton witnesses, whose initial depositions are all over the place. But by the time they come to testify, these stories have sort of narrowed into something that is, moderately coherent and consistent. But that's because he works with these witnesses to develop that testimony. That is something district attorneys do. But there was a lot of really shady stuff, happening there. I think the same, and I'm gonna flake on the name this morning. I'm sorry, but the drug addict who gets himself sprung. Yeah. That's also another one of those stories where Bundy understands what they're looking for, and he hands it to them.
Let's go back to. You live in Baton Rouge,
I do.
And you have an expertise on understanding New Orleans, but also Louisiana. I'm from Canada, so I don't have that expertise. I don't have that knowledge. So perhaps you can talk a bit about Louisiana and New Orleans, and what is it about those places that makes this case interesting or stand out, or what do people need to know about Louisiana and New Orleans?
Yeah, I would say just kind of generally, I'm really grateful. I came to LSU in 2007, and that was my second academic job. I taught at Georgia State University before that, and had worked in the Louisiana State Museum for 6 years before that. So I've been at this a long time now.
Yep.
And but one of my charges, and I was hired to teach Louisiana history, and I teach a big survey course on Louisiana history every semester. And I'm really grateful for that because, before I had that job, I really was, I think I had a lot of expertise on New Orleans. I had less expertise about the state. And that has really kind of enhanced my understanding of not just how New Orleans is distinctive, but how it fits into the state's history. And the state's history is it's not that it's just conservative. It's that, there seems to be, historically speaking, a kind of, a preference for demagoguery.
Right.
among the populace at the state level, and in many cases at the local level. And it's also really important, and I do this in Cruising for Conspirators, is really explain how Jim Garrison became so empowered in his first term in office that by the time he got to investigating the Kennedy assassination, there were no controls over him, none. I mean, he effectively was unsupervised. He had the governor in his pocket. He arguably got John McKithen elected. And so McKithen, is hands off. He has beaten the attorney general at the United States Supreme Court. And, so he's a super empowered local official. And you have to sort of understand that larger context of what was happening in Louisiana, not just in the 1960s, but over time, to understand how somebody could be operating in the way that he was operating during that period of time.
I think there was a history of police corruption in Louisiana as well.
Yeah, and this new book that I'm working on, what's so interesting to me is how these people keep popping up over time. And so Pershing Gervais, right, is dismissed from the police force in 1953 for, they sort of soft pedal, but there is testimony that he and his partner are actually coordinating these safe cracking robberies, right, while they're cops. Right. And so ultimately he's dismissed from the police force. And this all happens. The new book is about marriage and a murder and a miscarriage of justice in the early 1950s. And there's a murder of this woman named Diddy Cooper by her then husband, James Cooper, who owned the Court of Two Sisters restaurants. You can sort of see how this is all sort of floating around in the French Quarter. And Gervais is right in the middle of it, right? And this big police corruption scandal, I think in part accounts for why there's such a miscarriage of justice in her murder. But so you have to sort of, know who these people are and who these characters are. And so if you know that backstory about Pershing Gervais, Jim Garrison making him his chief investigator in 1962 is this extraordinary kind of FU, right? Yeah. And also a kind of indicator of how that office will be run in terms of using that office to enrich themselves, using the legal process in ways that are very cynical. Yeah.
One of my favorite stories about Pershing Gervais was told to me by Milton Brenner, that he would find out which cases in the DA's office were not going to be prosecuted, and then he would go to those people and say, "Well, I can get your case dismissed if you pay me money." Mm-hmm. And of course, it would look at those people like he was highly successful.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. He was a real operator, and I love after he left the DA's office at the time of the first campaign for re-election for Garrison, that he told, I don't remember who he told this to, but he described himself as an underworld ombudsman. Right. It's classic. Yeah.
It's fascinating. Tell me a bit about perhaps a history of homosexuality in Louisiana or New Orleans and how it was looked upon in the 1960s, because sometimes people think, oh, well, New Orleans was so
Right.
open about stuff, but it wasn't completely open. So if you want to perhaps talk a bit about homosexuality back in
Sure.
the
I mean, there's,
60s.
this is important, I think, particularly because of, contemporary kind of conservative culture war issues. And I think sort of understanding the longer history of this is really important, particularly for young people who have, grown up in a world that is so different
Yeah.
from, the 21st century, world. And New Orleans likes to pride itself on being liberal, and its critics like to think of it that way. But there is actually, there are a lot of these, reformers in New Orleans in the early 1950s who are themselves kind of obsessed with homosexuality, and particularly the visibility of it in the French Quarter. And they battle it really hard through city ordinances, through lobbying the state legislature and having a sort of legal regime set up in place by the late 1950s in New Orleans, over the state, actually. And, homosexuality, which it would have been called at the time, it becomes a kind of this placeholder for decadence and the kind of disreputability that the city has. And so, there's a huge campaign. There's a big one in 1953. There's another one in 1958. And the early 1960s, police are raiding gay bars on a very, very consistent basis and just hauling people in. And often they're not even charged, but it's the harassment. And I'll also say, because, I think it's really important to distinguish, particularly when you're doing this kind of work, like, kind of close historical work, really to distinguish between the police and the district attorney's offices, because there's often a lot of tension in there. And what I found in the historical record, and I've written a couple of articles about it, is, the police are kind of dragged into this. Because for them, it's a lot of trouble and a lot of hassle to be raiding these bars all the time and dragging these people in and processing them. And then a lot of these cases just get nolle prossed. So it's like, it ups their level of, work, and processing people in the French Quarter. And I think they knew that for the most part, not always, but for the most part, the establishments that were gay or gay adjacent were no different than, and in many cases, a lot less criminally adjacent than many other places in the French Quarter. But they ultimately get sort of drawn into these reformers' quest to rid the city of New Orleans of this reputation and of visible, homosexual communities in the French Quarter. That is something that's important, again, to understand with regard to the Garrison investigation and the Shaw matter. And there's a photo that I use, and I think I'm sure you've seen this one, of 3 of Garrison's investigators sitting at a table, and it's full of, mugshots of men and boys. And you know exactly what those are. That's that big pool of pretty vulnerable gay people they have arrested. And now they can sort of, try to buttonhole and harass. And there are, a number of specific cases of that type. They don't create that, situation, but they exploit it mercilessly, not just in the case of Shaw, but in trying to find witnesses who will confirm these, this crazy theory that they have developed about, David Ferry and Clay Shaw and Lee Harvey Oswald.
And that also, I mean, combining that with the DA's power of subpoena, he actually could subpoena to appear either before the grand jury or in his office. But people were sort of scared of Garrison. He had a lot of power. They were nervous.
Absolutely, they were. I mean, a lot of gay people went underground, and you have people, talk about that in interviews that the district attorney's office does. And there also, there's one interview, and again, I'm not going to remember the specific name because there's so much of this kind of stuff, but that, one gay bar owner said that his partner had been told that if they would produce testimony, putting Clay Shaw and David Ferry together, that they could run their drag shows without harassment, right? And you also see it in Gene Davis's testimony before the grand jury, where he, is essentially like saying, "I'll say whatever you want me to say, because I've always given you evidence. Isn't that right, Mr. Garrison?" And then Garrison says, "Yes." And like Gene Davis is a kind of quintessential, kind of gay bar owner who is, very much part of a certain segment of the gay community in the French Quarter, but also an informant for the police, trying to balance all those things so he can stay in business.
Yeah.
And stay out of jail, ideally.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's an incredible milieu. And I mean, I'll go back to, there's one conspiracy author who claims the problem with me and others like you is that you don't understand New Orleans, and only this person understands New Orleans. And I find that, quite ridiculous that people say that, because you certainly understand New Orleans and Louisiana.
Well, I think you have to just with regard to this particular author, I recently discovered that there was a second part of a very absurd, it purports to be a book review of Cruising for Conspirators. And it's not, I can't really take it seriously because of the first one, in the first review that this person wrote, it was clear this person had not read the book.
Right.
I mean, I think they might have read an excerpt or a preview. But yeah, I mean, there's some people just so defensive and mean is not the right word, but just so sort of like angry and caustic and toxic.
Yeah.
And you can't, you cannot engage meaningfully with a person who approaches their subject matter in that way. And I'm about, as a professor, as a teacher, I'm all about, having respectful disagreements with people.
Yeah.
And walking away with a relationship with that person intact. And that to me is teaching, and that to me is dialogue. And I think there are some people in the conspiracy community with whom you can have conversations, but not many. Not many.
It's really, it's astounding how few you can.
And then I'll just say this, and then we can move on. But I also think there is no little sexism in some of the treatment that I received from one author in particular. And I hope that person will do some self-examination because I think they have a problem with women.
I hope so too, and I think you're right, but I somehow doubt it.
Well, I'm not going to get my hopes up, but
don't hold your breath.
No.
So let's talk a bit about Clay Shaw.
Okay.
What led Garrison to Clay Shaw, and what kind of life he was leading in New Orleans in the 1960s?
He had it pretty good right up until he becomes a suspect, and he'd been traveling. He was in Spain for a period of time. He was in England for a period of time. He had saved enough money and made enough money from flipping properties in the French Quarter that he had a secure retirement in place, and I think he was enjoying himself despite the dangers. I think he had a pretty active sex life, and that was an important part of his life, and had been for a long period of time. He's a very attractive man, and didn't have problems finding partners. When he is identified, what happened in December when he's interviewed in December? I think the tone of that interview is really interesting, because you see him in that particular interview kind of like balancing the danger he's in with a kind of covering, a sort of closetedness around his identity as a homosexual. And when he is, when he's arrested, there's this whole period of time where, for practical reasons, I think, but also because he's doing a lot of self-examination, he stops picking men up and having relationships. And a lot of people, fall away from him, and he kind of isolates himself. And there are a very small number of people with whom he has a relationship. Jeff Biddison is probably like the closest example, with whom he'd been a couple for, many years before. And, this upends his life. I mean, he becomes identified as a potential conspirator in the assassination of JFK. And I think about him often in the courtroom, watching the Zapruder film over and over and over, and watching Kennedy's head be blown apart, and being identified as a person who had something to do with that, to stand in that room. That was a really devastating, thing for him. And he never quite recovered from it. And, even when he is, there's a letter, I want to say it's like from maybe 6 months before he dies, he says, it doesn't matter that I was found not guilty. This is going to be my legacy. This is, and And that's also, a part of the tragedy is that despite losing resoundingly in court, right, in an environment that he largely controlled the terms of, Garrison, despite losing, he still goes after him, and when he dies, all bets are off. So, people who support Garrison just seem to elide the verdict in court. There's always a reason that it's corrupt. There's always a reason that these people are wrong, and it's I don't think it's a very balanced way to look at those events.
Now, the Garrison's supporters would say, well, Garrison never mentioned homosexuality.
Well, that is BS. And it's not true. Garrison was kind of a master of, saying something and then disowning having said it. Do you know what I mean? As it became inconvenient. And you can say what you want about James Phelan, but Garrison didn't sue him over that article. No. In fact, I also think Garrison was one of those people who understood the value of publicity, good or bad, right? As long as he was in the news, that was working for him in some way. So that's just not true. And I once saw a noted Garrison defender. I was on a panel with this person. It's one of the rudest people I've ever been on a panel with. Just like astoundingly rude and unprofessional. But this person, in talking about that James Phelan article, in response to a question from the audience, says, "Well, he made a mistake there and he was sorry." Well, how do you know? Number one, what difference does it make? You don't have to out somebody multiple times to have used that as a methodology to make somebody, legible as suspicious. And so, that is what happened. And, if you want to excuse it, you're welcome to do that. But that is not an even-handed, evaluation of that evidence.
I'm struck by his Playboy interview in September 1967. If you look at the preamble, the intro to that interview, they talk about Clay Shaw being the queen bee of the homosexual community in New Orleans. Well, that's not Garrison saying that, but he wrote a large part of that. It really is him saying it. He never objected to Playboy putting that in. Right. And there's these allusions all over the case.
Yeah, and then you're the person who made me aware of the Confidential article that appears just months before this case goes to trial, and the fact that it's fed by evidence from the district attorney's office, and the way that evidence was handled in that case is, just scandalous in terms of chain of custody. And I'm talking, about the material taken from Shaw's home the night of the arrest, and how that gets moved around to Robert Heath's office, how it goes to, Garrison's suburban home for a photo shoot with Life magazine. And, these are, that is just, it's like a complete, betrayal of the public trust, the way the evidence in that case was used. And I would be more shocked by it if it were a kind of unique circumstance. But, it was not. And, there were many shenanigans undertaken by Garrison and his investigators as regards evidence in that case and many others. What's amazing is that the case went to trial. That's the amazing thing. And that really has to do with cowardice on the part of those three judges who let the thing move forward. I think they were afraid of Garrison, and they were afraid of somehow being branded as people who didn't want to get to the truth about the Kennedy assassination. And that was a scary thing. At that period of time.
And that points to another thing about Garrison had a very, very, he was responsible for some of the judges getting elected. So he had some of the judges sort of in his back pocket.
Mm-hmm. He absolutely did. And I have read somewhere, and I don't know this to be the case. And I'm trying to remember, it was in a transcript of an interview that somebody gave, a deposition. And there was an implication that Haggerty, who had a drinking problem, Haggerty actually had bounced a bunch of checks. The district attorney's office, kind of knew this and kind of threatened to make it public if Haggerty didn't, play ball in their view. And that Haggerty made some of the calls he did, I think actually, was to his credit in that courtroom, knowing, that Garrison could make him look bad if he wanted to. But, and then, his behavior after the case, when he's like, caught in the motel room with the prostitutes and, brings porn movies from, that have been seized. It sort of gives you a sense of the irregularities that, are part of criminal district court in New Orleans during that era. It's a crazy, crazy story.
Yeah, and you could see it in some of the grand jury testimony. I mean, Carlos Quiroga's grand jury testimony, Garrison sort of threatening him, continually threatening him. You should think about what you're saying, and I'll give you time to go outside and take a break and come back in. And
and Bobuff too, right? I mean, who they, literally threaten, physically threaten, and have material of him that is, very incriminating. Try to hold that over his head, and that he refused to testify, and that he refused to help, undergird that flimsy story. I think also was pretty brave, right? In that moment, because, they'll threaten anybody to get what they want. I mean, it seems to me that's what the record suggests is happening. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And the other thing that I'm found striking is perhaps this whole case wouldn't have gone forward if there had been discovery in Louisiana courts.
Right.
The Garrison didn't have to disclose anything.
Very stingy. Yeah. And this is also a period of time when they have the non-unanimous jury verdicts. So in this case, I think there were 12. I think only 9 of them would have had to say guilty. To get a guilty verdict. The way, this worked at that time in Louisiana law, and that has since been addressed. And now you do have to have unanimous jury verdicts, particularly in capital cases. But, also, I'm asking you a question now, but what's so interesting is this is such a low bar case. I mean, it's a conspiracy case. Now, conspiracy cases can be extremely serious. And if he was convicted, he could spend a long time in prison. But they're fairly easy cases to prove if there is, in fact, a demonstrable conspiracy. Right? The crime didn't even have to happen. They just have to have people in discussion with each other. But the evidence, that they present for that of this, conspiratorial discussion is so flimsy. And Russo is such a disaster on the stand, also a very vulnerable person who is, manipulated, threatened, in certain ways. It's amazing that it went ahead. It's amazing that the trial, went on. And I guess I'm less familiar, and you maybe know more about this than I do, but I'm sort of less familiar with how that was evaluated from outside Louisiana. How people saw that, and did they see it as just a kind of, banana republic kind of, charade, in Louisiana, or was it, something that was taken seriously? And I'm trying to think, if I know the answer to that, I'm not so sure that I do, but I think, like the national networks, I think had Garrison's number. But they covered the case, because it was big news.
Yeah, and I think also, certainly in Louisiana, the Times-Picayune and the States Item really took him seriously. Mm-hmm. And they could have really blown a lot of this out of the water, but didn't say anything about Garrison until after the verdict.
Yeah. And that, that too is, the newspapers, then he needs to resign, but they're hedging their bets the whole time. And it reminds me of that, the time of the 1927 flood in the Mississippi River, and everybody in the city can see that the river is rising, but the newspapers are not printing anything about it, and it's, because they're involved in the business community, and the business community is concerned that this could hurt business. And, there's, and in a way, they give Garrison a pass for a long time. It's not that they're not critical of him. Sometimes they are, but just in terms of, the reporting on the thing, it's often very, shallow. And there were people who, bucked that trend. I think like Rosemary James is probably one of those people. But it makes you think about like what you're seeing in the newspapers and how to evaluate that on balance, in any case that you're looking at.
Yeah, you were one of the very lucky to talk to Rosemary James. What did she tell you about Garrison?
So I talked to her twice, and in one of the cases I did a formal oral history interview with her, and I have a transcript of it. And she she knew Shaw. I mean, she had dinner at his house. She was married to her, I think, first husband at the time. And, they were social people, but she was also, a television news reporter at this period of time. And she knew Garrison did not play fair, that he tried to make her the issue, once they, released that story, that they have somehow done him wrong. But, she went and told him that they were going to do it, and he could, ask them not to, or, have his side of it, kind of, and he didn't. And, that too, I think, is a calculation on his part, to get it out there, but then act like, the forces against me, or, stacked against me, kind of thing. And, it's, newspapers are not objective sources. They're the first draft of things, and, they make mistakes and they don't always correct them. And so you have to, make sure that, there's some kind of, corroboration, for particularly significant claims that they make.
Yeah. She, by the way, what do you think of, the prosecution of Garrison after the case for the bribery and with the pinball machines, and also the income tax evasion?
Well, I think probably, so two things about it. One is it's very interesting that Gervais, of course, is the person who, turns the evidence in the pinball case, testifies for the feds. I'll say this, he wasn't convicted.
Yep.
And, but the transcripts, the recorded transcripts that ran in the newspapers were extremely damaging. And I've never read, and I don't even know if full transcripts are out there. I've never read all the trial testimony in those 1970s cases. He's not convicted in either one of those cases. And the Justice Department then and now doesn't like to take things to court unless they think they can win. They didn't win against him. And that's important to acknowledge. But do I think Garrison was on the take? Absolutely. And I think there is evidence of that. It just apparently was not compelling enough in court to get a jury to convict him. And but even that, and this is probably some sort of like poetic justice, but like even at that, even though he's not convicted, that badly damages him. Not so much that he couldn't several years down the road get reelected as a judge because he is an appealing political figure to people, but he's not reelected. To that, what I guess it would have been the fourth term or the third term. I'm trying to think.
Yes, I think
the third term, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure, third or fourth. I lose track.
2 to 66 is 4 years. I think he's there. Yeah, I think it was the beginning of his fourth term. And Harry Connick Jr. or Harry Connick beats him. And I didn't know this at the time I published the book, but I found something. Garrison sued him and said the election was corrupt, and tried to sort of get the vote results overturned. And and that's just he's a sore loser. But again, he was not convicted, and he does then become a judge. And, that doesn't make him a saint, but, he, apparently some voters at least were willing to, overlook, those, trial, interview transcripts and recorded, conversations between him and Gervais.
Yeah. Well, if you read some of those recorded conversations, it's pretty damning. But of course, afterwards, Gervais sort of retracts everything because he wants to go back to New Orleans and have a life, and he realizes that Garrison still has some power. Ultimately, he does say no, it was real, but it's kind of interesting to note that. That is, Gervais had been around a long time, and had family, and children, and does come back to Louisiana, and he's critical of Garrison in the early 90s, when JFK comes out. He's one of the voices in the newspaper who says it was, all a sham and a scam. And, late in life, he gives an interview, I think it's to the Times-Picayune. And, he basically admits, that, to being sort of a quasi-criminal as a cop and after. But I think, he saw that, and a lot of people saw that as, just the way things were during that period of time. Yeah, he actually, I think he stole all the money on the take money from the police himself.
Yeah, and took a police
Yeah.
character, a woman drug addict in New York City. Yeah, it's like this. I'm in the records now for 1953 and the investigation into the police, and he fights really hard to be reinstated, and it's ultimately the Louisiana Supreme Court that turns back his claim. He kind of tries to make a civil service claim to be reinstated to the police. So that was important to him, but at that point he essentially becomes like an underworld bar owner, and very criminally adjacent. Oh, and I just wanted to say one more thing, which is that, the tax evasion charges, Aaron Cohn is the person who turns over evidence to the Justice Department about a Garrison's taxes versus, salary and, what he's spending. And Cohn was a dogged investigator and also, an enemy of Garrison's. But he's the person who does that. This is not like the CIA telling the Justice Department to, Garrison had, throttled them in the press, and I'm sure they didn't like him any, but they receive evidence from a local source that leads to the tax evasion charges. So this is not some sort of, criminal conspiracy, or emanating from the CIA or the FBI. It's Cohn, and it's a personal grudge in that particular case.
The funny thing in the bribery case was that Garrison fired his attorneys in the middle of the case, and then became his own attorney, and that probably turned the case around. He gave a long summation at the end, I think, that probably convinced people. Part of his whole theory was they're after me because of the assassination, blah blah blah, and I mean, it was crazy. It was absolutely crazy in a certain way.
He must have been. He must have been impressive.
Yeah.
In the courtroom, with opening statements and closing statements. But, one of the things I say at the end of Cruising for Conspirators is I think he kind of, do you know what jump the shark means?
Yeah.
He sort of jumped the shark at a moment in that summation where he basically says a conspiracy charge is like a murder, and he gets the thing ginned up into something so big that I think it might have given the jury pause. What we have here before us is not a very good case. And then he's sort of like, saying, this is about the president's murder, and if you don't find this person guilty, you're implicated in letting the government get away with this conspiracy to kill the president. And I think he really overdid it there, and I think that probably in no small part contributed to the outcome among the jury members, although they were also just exhausted and worn down by the time they went into that room. I mean, they've been through a marathon of closing statements. So,
do you think there was? Do you think Garrison was actually gay himself, and there may have been some repressed homosexuality that played a part in this?
So, I think again, Aaron Cohn is a person who very closely documents Garrison's extraordinary sex life. That's what Cohn calls it. And Garrison certainly was sexually reckless. As a person who was married and, father to 5 children, I think, he brazenly, had affairs. And, mostly what is documented is very young women. And he did, frequent like Norma Wallace's house. And, so he's clearly having sex with women, but there's a kind of undercurrent of, like men having sex with other men on the down low, is, what we would call it now. Right. And I think there's certainly the possibility of that. And I think that for 2 reasons. One is, I recently discovered a newspaper story about Gervais when he was about 15 years old. And he's in a car with a 30-year-old man very late at night. And there's a car accident. And he's injured, so he ends up going to the hospital. And when I first looked at it, I didn't think a lot about it. And then I came back to it, and it's like, is he hustling? And there's this whole kind of like hustling culture in and around the French Quarter. And, again, Gervais married children, but I do think there are, men who have sex with other men. And of course, the best evidence for sort of thinking about Garrison's sexual compulsivity, if that's a word, like, you know, is grabbing the teenage boy in New Orleans Athletic Club. And so I think for him, it might have been more about youth than about, you know, gender per se. And I tend to think, and again, I'm not an LGBT plus person, but, you know, I tend to think of being gay as sort of like an identity that people adopt, and, you know, and being proud of who they are, not just sexually, but on the whole. And so, like, I think of being gay as an identity. And then I think, you know, some people engage in sex acts that they don't identify with. Do you know what I mean? Like, they don't see it as part of, you know, and I think there was a lot of that kind of thing, you know, in New Orleans in the 1950s and 60s, you know, men who married because everybody was expected to get married. You know, if you didn't get married, that was like considered the problem. But then might also have been having sex with other people, male or female. So, you know, I don't think he was gay, but I think there's, you know, a possibility that, you know, he had sex of some kind or the other with men. Sure, absolutely. And, you know, here's an example, like a weird example around this is, it's in the book of another Garrison defender who talks about Garrison and this friend of his having sex with a woman, you know, a sort of a menage a trois, one gal, two guys, but that they never touched each other's penises. Like, you know, oh, well, then, like, you know, good times. You know, it's like, I mean, it's just sort of, there's this, you know, desperate attempt to excuse everything he does as somehow, you know, wholly pure. And, you know, it's a very strange story. But I think it might, in fact, be a very telling story.
Yeah, I went through the papers of Patricia Lambert,
Uh-huh.
and she has I have not published it, but she has a full transcript of talking to that boy from the New Orleans Athletic Club, in which he talks about what happened, and also the boy's brother.
Right.
Two transcripts, and so some really damning evidence there. But
Yeah, and you know, also, where are her papers?
Sixth Floor Museum.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's great. I'm glad they're there. Yes, that happened, I'm sure. But what is also true is that the Good Old Boys Network protected him.
Yeah.
And he had a lot of control over the grand jury, who the grand jury foreman was. And Labiche, I've recently discovered Labiche, who was one of the grand jury foremen during this period of time in the 1950s, was also a grand jury foreman. So there are these, you know, there's this kind of, I hesitate to call it this, but that's the way it functions, kind of Good Old Boys Network, in which this is kind of covered up. And so Drew Pearson writes about it, but the local newspapers don't write about it. And Aaron Cohn, you know, writes a letter and says, you know, this happened and the grand jury needs to look into this. And, you know, he got away with it. You know, and that's certainly, you know, assault. It's, you know, attempted crime against nature. You know, he could easily have been charged with a 1489 if that family had been willing to, you know, come forward and do that. But you know, they too have interests in the community.
Yep.
And I think, you know, also the interest of their sons, you know, at least one of whom was a minor. And so, you know, that would have been a very, you know, I don't want to say shameful, but I think it would have been a very embarrassing thing to have pursued charges against the sitting district attorney.
Yeah, and they were a prominent Catholic family with some high-ranking Catholic clergy, so it was a very there was no way they were going to bring that forward. Well,
and also the you know, speaking of, you know, high-ranking Catholic clergy and people covering for them, you know, Connick did that very consistently. You know, sort of like made cases or allegations against priests. You know, go away for long periods of time. So yeah, this again, the Good Old Boys Network at work. You know, people looking out for each other.
So the sad part of this whole case is the fact that unfortunately Clay Shaw died before his damages case could be heard, which then allowed Garrison to write about Shaw in his book and say whatever he wanted to say.
Right.
That was very unfortunate.
It was, and I'm not, you know, what's so interesting is that weird quirk in Louisiana civil law that said, you know, you had to have these kind of immediate family members who could step in as plaintiff. he didn't have anybody in that category. So, the claim ultimately, according to Louisiana law, dies. And the Supreme Court decides that the Louisiana law is not inherently prejudicial, which says much more about the way people thought about, families and categories of, relationship during that period of time in the law. And again, I think that's really reflective of our own moment, where there are parties who are attempting, in the United States to pathologize unmarried, childless pet owners, and somehow the problem. These are levers that people try to pull, and Shaw's sexuality was one of those levers that Garrison was willing to use to try and bring a case forward against a person who had some vulnerabilities, but also had enough resources to hire very good attorneys and, defend himself in court.
Thankfully, and that raises the whole issue of people who can't afford those sort of lawyers, and the miscarriages of justice that occur because of that.
Absolutely. And I can't remember the percentage. It's something I talk about in class, in my Louisiana history class. There's a far higher percentage of people in jail incarcerated in Louisiana. And we incarcerate more people than anyone else in the world per capita. And most of those people have pled out. The majority of people never get to trial. They take a lower charge, they make some sort of deal for lesser time. And so there's a way in which our whole, contemporarily, but also historically, the way the law is used, not to bring about justice, but to really kind of like keep certain populations of people under control, by manipulating those things. And, I think in many significant ways, Louisiana is a kind of on the leading edge of, injustice in the United States with its current carceral crisis and many of those things, but also because of the way the contemporary administration in Louisiana has just written off anybody who disagrees with a very, conservative Christian nationalist kind of, position, i.e. like putting the 10 Commandments in every classroom in the state, including at universities. And I'm hoping lawsuits will, keep that from happening, because I would find that deeply offensive to have to teach in a university classroom with a biblical passage required to be in every room. So yeah, it's a lot of extremes down here.
Absolutely. So, you teach, you've taught a course on conspiracy, and so tell me a bit about your students and what they think, and after what they think after going through your course,
right,
about this case and other cases of conspiracy.
I've noticed something in the class, and I don't know what this means. I've taught it. I want to say I've taught it 3 times now. It's an upper division course, and it's a fairly demanding course. And so they have to, show up and be prepared, or they just can't successfully, navigate the course. And I have more women who take that course than men. And women are a majority of, university students in the United States today anyway. But the male students who have taken that course tend to be far more conspiracy minded than the women. And I don't know what that's about. But that's just what I've noticed in that course. And I think there's a lot of young men use Reddit, and, there is a lot of, this kind of conspiratorial conversation on Reddit. And I think there's a way, particularly that young men are being socialized around conspiracy that is different for young women who are being fed different kind of things by algorithms or are using different platforms. So, my students are really interesting, and they teach me things all the time about, what's out there in the digital world and, what they're seeing, things I have no idea about, because I don't use social media that much. But, I think they're pretty smart. And, I think they're a self-selected group, these particular students, but they're very skeptical of, broad conspiracy claims. And they come to their own conclusions about those sort of things. I'm not there to, persecute people who believe in conspiracies, but they often, will, self-report about relatives or, stepdads or, whatever, like being like real conspiracy, nuts, and how uncomfortable that makes them. And, what's so alarming about that is that, conspiracy has a very long history in the United States, and it, sort of like bubbles up here and there. But I can't think of a time besides the McCarthy era when conspiracy has been so consequential in American politics. They just got a tendency to believe in conspiracy and to think very lazily about things, to not think critically about, claims that are being put out in front of you. And so, it's particularly consequential at the moment in a way that you have sort of like QAnon advocates who are now very influential members of Congress. And, charlatans are not. They hold these offices of enormous consequence in people's lives. And so, it's a very, it's a time when I think it's important to slow down and think about things carefully, rather than just kind of getting whipped up, by the claim of the moment.
On the JFK side, it used to be it was the left wing that was all conspiratorial, but now it's the right wing has discovered, oh my God, it's a deep state. Right. And I'm seeing more and more congressmen or senators and Republicans who are like, oh, the JFK assassination. Oh my God, this is evidence of the deep state. And the same forces. It's striking, and it's very it's horrifying.
But if you think about it, like that's where the JFK Records Act come from. Now, I'm very grateful for the JFK Records Act. Yeah, and I think in the end, it's a good piece of legislation. But what it was responsive to is Oliver Stone's movie. Yep. And his theory of the case, which runs completely counter to the conclusions taken by, the government bodies, investigative bodies who looked into the case. So, they get whipped up into cultural, soup too, and do things that sometimes have, beneficial consequences, but come out of, a willingness to, accept a kind of theorizing about the intelligence agencies or, good Lord. It's crazy times. Yeah. So the one thing I do say about Jim Garrison and Clay Shaw and the whole case is I wish somebody would make a movie. I do too, and I wish they would license my book. But what a great topic for a movie. It's just. Oh yeah. When I tell people this story, they're so fascinated. Nobody really knows it, and it's a very interesting story. Yeah, I tell you, and this is probably just me being like older or old fashioned, but young people don't read books, and if somebody could make a version of this that runs counter to the kind of mythologies, shaming of people in JFK and tell that story from, a different angle. I think that'd be fabulous. Time will tell, huh? Time will tell. So yeah. we're gonna end the interview, but I think I don't know, is there anything else you want to tell us about, your terrific book? Well, thank you for your compliments. And, one of the great things about being a professor or a writer or a thinker, and you know this too, is that, you're constantly learning how to do new things. And in part, that's the kind of appeal of that sort of work. And so I was, moving probably plottingly in a narrative nonfiction direction there. And I'm going to move further in that direction in this next project, which, I see as a series of books. Right. That gets us back to this question. And I hope to retell this story in a different way. as I go on this journey with this new set of books. So, I'm excited about the future, but I also stand by Cruising for Conspirators, and it's the book I'm proud of. It's in the evidence, and I think I did try to be even-handed and objective, but I wasn't in the bag for anybody. I had an idea that this had been a miscarriage of justice, but I think it was, and I think that book shows it, and as does your work, kind of like your books show us the kind of pathologies, not just in conspiracy thinking about the JFK assassination, but just kind of more more specifically around the Garrison case. So I appreciate you having me and getting to be a part of this broader group of conversations with people who I also really admire and respect and learn from, and have fruitful discussions even if we don't always agree. And,
great. It's great having you. When can we expect your next book? Is there a time frame?
So, actually, I'm getting ready for the fall semester, and I'm setting some deadlines for myself so I don't get pulled way off track. And I'm hoping to have a first draft by, like a year from now.
Right.
And these are, it's not, it's not a book like Cruising. It's not it's not like a 10-year enterprise. So I'm hoping to kind of move through these at a faster clip. But it's a different kind of work for me. So I feel like I have to produce a full example out of the series in order to look for an agent and then try to sell the longer series. So I've talked to enough people in publishing to understand that, because my track record is somewhere else, that I have to produce the first book in the proposed series and then go from there. So I'm hoping in about a year I'll have a full draft.
Great. I can hardly wait. It's going to be a fantastic book. I know it.
Well, you're very kind, and it's a lot of fun to talk to you always. So
you're amazing, and so we'll have more discussions on Garrison. We'll have a panel discussion, et cetera, et cetera. But thank you very much, Alecia, and we really appreciate your tremendous work.
Well, that's very kind of you, and thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much.